Well, if you have your Bibles, you can open them to Matthew 13, or I can sell you a bridge. That's on my computer. I didn't know it was going to be a part of our worship service. Okay, so Matthew 13. We're going to read that in just a minute. I want to tell you the story of a hunter that I read about this week who had a dream all of his life. He was an avid hunter, had a dream all of his life to bag a brown bear. He wanted a brown bear. And so he saved up, and the hunting dream came true. He was able to go up into Maine somewhere, and he was hunting. He was deliriously happy, and then he actually stumbled on a brown bear who was trying to catch fish at a stream. And so he stealth. He was trying to be as quiet as he could, put his sights on the bear. At which point the bear turned around and talked to him. Now this was surprising. And the bear looked at the man and said, "Now wait a second. What do you think you're doing? Really, shouldn't we negotiate this? Shouldn't we have a moment of conversation and talk about what could happen here?" He said, and the guy was flabbergasted. Of course, he was going to say, "Well, yeah, sure, I guess. I mean, what would you say to a talking bear? Can I hire you?" That's what I'd say. So he says, the bear says to him, "Listen, what is it that you really want here?" And the man said, "Well, I want to kill a bear because I want a fur coat for the winter. Winters are cold in Maine. You know that. I want a fur coat." And the bear said, "Well, that's good. That's reasonable. That makes sense. I understand. I'll tell you what I want." And the guy said, "Okay, what do you want?" He says, I'm hungry. I want a belly full of food." And the hunter said, "Well, I get that. That makes sense." And so the hunter put down his gun. The two of them walked off into the forest to negotiate this. And the bear came out alone. Both needs were met. See, this is why I really wish Al Murray was here, because he could just do the joke right. The point of the story is... I'm not a joke teller.
No.
Have you noticed? The point of the story is some compromises can be deadly. All right, fine. When I heard this joke told by Greg Laurie on the radio, it was hysterical. I laughed until I almost fell out of the car. All right. Well, we're going to talk about compromise today. Compromise isn't a bad word. It's not a four-letter word. There are times when compromise works. First of all, let's have a good definition for compromise. I think this one works. Compromise is making concessions or accommodations with another party who disagrees with a set of standards. So it has accommodations, there's some tolerance, some leeway in our negotiations. And this is not foreign to husbands and wives, right? You want to go out for dinner, it's a Friday night, and, guy says, "Where do you want to go?" And the wife says, "I don't care." There's actually a restaurant somewhere in this country, I think it's in Texas, I could be wrong, and it's called I Don't Care. So I'm thinking that guy who thought of that was really smart. But the wife will say, "Well, I don't care," and this is what I'll say. I said, "Well, let's go get Italian." She said, "No, I don't want Italian." And I said, "Well, if you're leaving it up to me." I said, "Well, what would you want?" "Mexican." Okay, so we go do Mexican. But the next week we do Italian. Why? We're compromising. We're just working out a relationship that we want to have flourish. We don't want to have fights on the way to the restaurant. Parents and children do this all the time as well. I remember when our girls were growing up that they would want the car on a weekend. And I would negotiate for the use of the car. I'd get chocolate chip cookies out of it. I was fine with that. You can use the car. There was a time in our history, America's history, where there was an event called the Great Compromise in 1787. Anybody familiar with this historic event? This historic event actually took place at one of the Congresses. And the states were arguing about how many representatives were going to be in both houses of the government, in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And the two states that were wrangling over that, well, they were all wrangling, but two states brought together proposals. I think it was New Jersey and Connecticut. And the proposals were, the two proposals were blended in some kind of a conference setting. So that what we have today is what they agreed to. The House of Representatives is stocked by population. In other words, it's proportionate representation. But the Senate, no matter what state, gets 2 senators, period. And that's called the Great Compromise in 1787. And we're living with that compromise today. So I think these are things that are pretty good things. But we also see compromise in the Bible. Just think about the book of Acts, for example. In Acts 15, there's a great compromise there about how Jews and Gentiles were going to worship together in the same church. And a letter went out. This is how you're going to do it. And you're going to respect one another. And this is what we expect of you Gentiles. This is what we expect of you Jews. Paul, in Romans, in the church in Rome, there was still this problem of how Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians would relate to each other given their different backgrounds. And Paul said, well, look, if days and meat are a big deal, then don't make a big deal out of it. If somebody wants to, recognize one day greater than another, let them go ahead. What is the problem? If somebody doesn't like meat, don't eat meat in front of them. The meat that is sold to idols, don't eat that meat. Just live with one another in a compromise that's helpful for everybody. We also see a compromise in the Old Testament with Moses. You wouldn't think Moses was a compromiser, but when 2.5 tribes wanted to live on the other side of Jordan, after they got past their wrangling, Moses said, okay, and God seemed to bless it. So some compromises are good. They help us to live together in harmony and peace and to respect one another. However, there are compromises that are not. They're dangerous. Think about Lot. Lot made a terrible decision in his life by living in Sodom, and then things just went downhill from there. Or Esau. He made a compromise for some soup and bellied away his birthright. Solomon's probably the best example in the Old Testament of somebody who compromised his integrity with God. He had so many wives who worshipped idols, and then he just gave in to them, and he gave them all that they would need to worship their idols. And this is strange, coming from the man who wrote, a righteous man who gives in when pressured by the wicked is like a muddied spring or a polluted fountain. And you think, well, man, what can you do with a muddy spring and a polluted fountain? Well, you can't wash any clothes in it, and you certainly wouldn't drink from it. So what kind of counsel would you get from somebody who is a compromiser like that? You wouldn't want to trust them. But thankfully, the Bible has tremendous strong leaders who started strong and finished strong. Daniel, Joshua, even David. These were lighthouse leaders for the people of God. Now, you don't need to be a Christian to know that some compromises are deadly. How many people do you know who have gambled away their fortunes or been trapped in pornography and ruined their families? It compromised their integrity, and it's eaten them alive. You may have even experienced that pleasant, soft voice, that comes and says, oh, come on, just once. Just once. It wouldn't hurt anything to do it just once. You know what just once is? It's the Frito-Lay potato chip commercial. That you can't eat just one. No, it always goes to another. So, God has some wisdom here for us in this final chapter of Nehemiah. So let's read it, starting with verse 1. We're going to read to verse 14. On that day they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of all the people, and it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. For they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. As soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all of those of foreign descent. Now, before this, Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah. Now remember, Tobiah, we haven't met him in a long time, but he's an Ammonite, and he was absolutely opposed in every possible way to the building of the wall in the previous chapters. So Eliashib prepared for Tobiah a large chamber where he had previously put the grain offering and the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil. These are all those little chambers. If you ever see a diagram of a floor plan of the temple, you'll see little chambers around the outside of the holy place. And these are those rooms. They were storehouses for people to bring their offerings to, and the Levites would store them there. Let's go to verse 6. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. And after some time, I asked leave of the king and came to Jerusalem. And then I discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And I was very angry. And I threw out the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. And then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers. And I brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. I also found out that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them. So the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled each to his field. So I confronted the officials and I said, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" And I gathered them together and I set them in their stations. Then all Judah brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. And I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, Pedaiah of the Levites, and their assistant Hanan the son of Zakur, and the son of Mattaniah. For they were considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute to their brothers. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and his service. So here's the background of what's happened. Nehemiah had been in Jerusalem for about 12 years while he was building the wall. At some point, we're not sure when, he returned to Susa, to King Artaxerxes, most likely to give some sort of report about how things were going in Jerusalem. He left his fellow Eliashib, the high priest, in charge. Eliashib was their Nehemiah. When Nehemiah found out what Eliashib had done, he was angry. We'll talk about that anger in a minute. But he was very angry, and he decided to return to Jerusalem in order to fix what had gone wrong. If you remember the chapter 10 commitments that the people made, they decided they were going to live under the lordship of God's direction for all of their lives in 4 specific areas. In their home life, in their, we would call church life, their worship, and how they would conduct their business, and how they would relate to the community around them. They said, we're going to put God first in our lives. Whatever time has passed has started to unravel those commitments. They're getting lax. They're getting lazy. And Nehemiah needs to correct this. And the first compromise that we read here is about Tobiah. That's what that first 3 verses are all about, to give us the background. Why is Tobiah, and the Ammonites especially, not allowed to have any portion with the people of God? Because way back during the wilderness trek, when the people were out in the wilderness and needed water, the Ammonites said, "No way, Jose." And God took great displeasure at that. He was angry with them and decided that they would be enemies of God for the rest of the generations, at least until the gospel came along. And what's worse is Balaam was a part of that whole mess, and he was hired to pronounce curses on God's people, and God reversed all of those curses, of course. So these people were not allowed to have anything to do with the temple and worship of God. These chambers were for storage, not for people. Well, actually, some people lived there. The Levites were allowed to stay there while they were working in the temple, as it was their particular schedule. Now, Eliashib knew all of this. He was the high priest. He knew the word. It was his job to know the word and teach the word, but he ignored it. And as a result, the religious life of Israel began to unravel. Well, the second compromise had to do with the Levites. The priests were not receiving the tithes and offerings that were their due so that they could do the work of the temple. And as a result, if you don't got an income, you got to go back to work, and they went back to work in their own fields. So Eliashib failed on 2 counts. He failed to teach and instruct and hold the people accountable to God's word. Now, when Nehemiah hears all of this, it says he got angry. Now, why would he get angry? Because the project was was about more than a wall. The wall was fine. The project, the end game, was the restoration of God's people as a worshiping people, as a light in Jerusalem to the nations. And this is what angered him, because that light was going out. And so he went back. He was going to take this compromise by the throat. In fact, a lot of different translations will use different words for angry, but here's what it means. It's really super bad, and I am really mad. It's like calling good evil and evil good. That's the sense of Nehemiah's anger and what motivated him to return. These people are now dismissing their spiritual standards. They're drifting away from their purpose in God. And all of this is resulting in carelessness about the temple and worship and life and ethics and negligence in the home. This is not good. Ever. Right? So he returns to Jerusalem. He took matters into his own hands big time. He goes to Tobiah's chamber. I could just see this. He just storms in without so much as a hello, how are you, Mr. Tobiah? And starts chucking his stuff right out the room into the street. He says, go. And then he cleanses. He has a place dedicated again to the service of God. He goes to the leaders and he rebukes them. He said, what are you doing? It's not a rhetorical question, but they don't answer. And so he says, okay, I'm going to do this myself. And he sets the Levites back in place, charges them with their responsibility. And notice that once that happened, when the leaders were in place where they needed to be, everybody started bringing in their tithes and their offerings, and the temple worship began to flourish once again. And I love the prayer at the end. I'll tell you, there's a particular word as to why. But notice what he says. Remember me, O God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds. That's an interesting word in the Hebrew. It's the word hesed. I love that word. It's the Old Testament equivalent of the word grace. Most often it's translated loving kindness. God's loving kindness. And he's saying, get what Nehemiah is saying here. Lord, remember my loving kindness in this. He's doing something loving. Now he's angry. He's storming in to take over, set things right. And he's doing it in a loving motivation. That's so important, especially if you're a leader in a church or in the home. You may be motivated by a displeasing situation, a kind of anger that says this isn't right, this is not good. That's okay. And the reason that you can do that is because it arises out of the goodness and the love of God. But it motivates you to make corrections in a loving way, not in a harsh way. Hesed can be a firm action of love performed by a loving hand. So when we experience threats to compromise, what should we do? Well, we're going to learn 3 things that Nehemiah did to help us to spot those kinds of compromises, and also 3 ways that we can take them by the throat. So when we're tempted, when compromise tempts us to take us by the throat, first of all, understand it might come in one of 3 ways. The first way is the pressure of ungodly relationships. Now here, Eliashib and Tobiah are some sort of related somehow, most likely through marriage. They may be in-laws. But any kind of relationship can bring pressure to us to compromise. 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, bad company corrupts good morals. And so believers and unbelievers are in the same family, we're in the same workplaces, in the same schools. And so there's always going to be, believer, understand one thing. We're in a warfare all the time. All the time. Can you say amen? Amen. It doesn't matter where you are, there is spiritual warfare against believers all the time. So we can have pressure coming at us in a lot of different directions, and not just from people. But what about the books we read? What about the movies we see? What about the music we listen to? These things can influence our thinking and influence our spiritual lives. Now, I'm not suggesting that we need to read only Christian books and listen to only Christian music or, the classics. I don't mean that. But what I do mean is examine everything in the light of God's moral structures. Right? Do the good guys get away with it? There's a really disappointing movie we saw. I thought it was going to be fun. I just love the actors who were in it. It was called, I don't even remember the name of it now. Nita, do you remember those three guys? It was Morgan Freeman. What movie? Morgan Freeman, Michael Caine, and Alan Arkin. They robbed a bank. They lost their pensions because the company went belly up, and they said, we're going to rob a bank, because they saw these people do it. Says we could get away with it. And so there's great actors, comical. I mean, at one point, Alan Arkin is running away from a security guard, and the guy's got a gun on him, and Arkin stops, and he says, look, I'm just tired, okay? He's 80 years old. So there's a lot of humor in it, but at the end of the movie, guess what? They all get away with it. So I asked myself, we talked about it, are they glorifying theft? I don't know what to think of it. God would not glorify theft. So we look at everything, listen to everything, read everything in the light of God's moral and ethical structures that we read in Scripture. And if it is promoting or glorifying something that is not of God, just don't do it. Just don't do it. Don't compromise and say, well, they had good actors. That's my compromise. Okay? We live in a very uncritical and tolerant age, and it's a danger to grace. So Solomon's advice, keep your heart with all vigilance, because from it flows the springs of life. Well, the other kind of pressure that can come to us is for convenience or gain. When I'm thinking about Eliashib, what was his motive? Why did he do this? First of all, there's the pressure of an in-law, perhaps, that Nehemiah says that very clearly, so I think there's something going on there. But I don't think that's all. I think there's something in it for Eliashib. He didn't just give him a chamber. He gave him a large chamber. There's no reason to say that unless somehow this is to indicate that there's going to be good payback for Eliashib. And so he's giving in because he's going to gain something. Maybe he got some money from Tobiah. Maybe he got prestige. It doesn't say what the advantage is. But it just makes sense because that's how the human heart works. But here's the problem with what Eliashib did. He misused his place of ministry. He abused his responsibility, and he misused his authority. Now, that's something that we all can understand. We all have seen leaders in the church and leaders in the government or leaders in schools fail in their leadership. That they might use their leadership and their position for personal gain. It's very, very tempting to do that. Covetousness never satisfies, Paul says. And it leads to becoming a friend of the world. It starts small, like power plays and manipulation, cutting corners, that sort of thing. Think about I think the saddest words in the New Testament from Paul is one of his letters to Timothy about his friend Demas. And he said to Timothy, do your best to come soon, because Demas is in love with this present world and deserted me. I don't think that Paul wrote that just as a matter of fact. I get a sense as I read it that there was some sorrow and tears in there, not because Demas left him, but the reason why Demas left him, to go back into the world. And I'm guessing, just my guess, just pure opinion, being the kind of leader that Paul was, he probably said to himself, why didn't I see this coming and do something to help him? Wouldn't that be the natural response of any good, godly leader? Very sad words, and Jesus himself said it. You cannot serve two masters. You are going to love one and hate the other, or you're going to hate the one and love one and despise the other. So, the third pressure can come from relaxed value commitments. We are people who, even though we are redeemed, are allergic to things like the lordship of Christ and discipleship. I had a friend who developed this amazing structure for churches to put in place in order to be a whole church disciple-making structure, so that every aspect of ministry didn't reduplicate the other one. They all had a particular place, and they added something different to each aspect of being a follower of Jesus. It was lovely. It was great. It was huge and complex in some ways because he was an engineer before he was a minister, right? So he's got lines and boxes and drawings. But we were able to implement it in our church. But what surprised me was how many people who had been believers for quite a long time said, I don't want to do this. I don't like it. Really, you don't like reading the Bible every day? You don't like learning how to pray? Share your faith? Are you serious? That's what disciples do. Well, after a while, I talked to my friend who was actually a member of our church, and I said, why is this happening? Why is it that so many believers would just say, I don't want to be a part of that? He said, well, I learned a long time ago, the church in America is allergic to discipleship. I went, really? That doesn't sound good. That doesn't sound hopeful. We are by nature allergic, and we would like to loosen the value commitments just a little bit. Just a little bit here and there. But I'll tell you what happens. It happens gradually. It doesn't happen right away. It happens over time. The degree to which the heart becomes insensitive to the seriousness of sin is the degree to which we lose sight and taste for God's holiness. We had a friend back in Minnesota. His name was Richard. This was many, many years ago when our church had, we called them discipleship homes, one for men and one for women. And at the time, a lot of the young men and women who were in those homes were coming out of the drug culture. So we're talking about the late 70s and early 80s. Well, this young man actually came out of the gay culture. We had a gay bathhouse right across the street from the church. This is downtown Minneapolis. And so he I don't know how it happened. He wandered in, he talked to somebody, whatever. But he gave his life to Christ. And he moved into our discipleship homes. And he was really changing. I mean, we gave those young people room and board for work in the church, construction, janitorial, whatever we could do to help them to stay in the home and separate themselves from the things that they had been entrapped